Welcome to the party, pal. This is Fountainhead Forum 35. I have LB Muñiz of the Ben Awake with LB podcast. You can also find him at benawake.com. That's BEEN awake.com. How you doing, LB?
I'm doing great, Chris. Thanks for having me on. Looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to this conversation. It's going to be very interesting. What do you think about the recent stuff going on with Project Veritas and James O'Keefe?
Well, from my understanding is the board of directors of the 501c3 have put him on like some sort of mandatory leave, which came very suddenly. He hasn't said anything, and there are rumors, and there have been confirmed or unconfirmed rumors that there has been an attempt at a coup to oust him from his leadership position. I believe the core of this has something to do with a letter signed by, I believe, 16 people. I may have seen some reports that some people have said that they were quoted inaccurately within that as signatories or the stories within. But that basically there's been this thing that he, by all accounts, seems like a difficult person to work for. But I think for most people out there, and certainly the impression that I've seen from people is that, James O'Keefe is synonymous with Project Veritas. I mean, considering that he started it. So it's, there's not a ton of information out there. I mean, it is worth noting that this happened just a couple of weeks after they did a massive expose against one of the major the major pharmaceutical companies who out there, and potentially, creating a liability for criminal action in the process. So I think it's interesting. I've heard a lot of speculation. People closer than me to the situation seem to think that this is some sort of concerted coup where the board of directors is trying to remove him from his leadership position and, have access to the funds that are there. And I think that that's pretty awful. I mean, if this is the worst case scenario, that an organization like that has been infiltrated to the point that people want to take it over, the question remains, is it simple greed or is it ideological? And I think, depending on which direction the story goes, if you will kind of tell the future, because, I know they don't have a lot of impact on the national scale, but that doesn't mean that a lot of the work they've done, some of the stories they do are kind of like, okay, this isn't groundbreaking, but they've done some groundbreaking work that eventually has always been incorporated into the narrative, as far as government collusion with big tech companies in particular, and then also going back to just government collusion at the beginning with Acorn.
Yeah, they've been embarrassing a lot of the bad guys. I don't know if I necessarily agree with them on everything or even agree with their methods, but the results seem to work. And I'm, the only thing I've been saying to myself, well, gee, I wonder why they didn't accuse him of sexual harassment or rape or something like that. Because that's usually what they do when they want to do something like this.
Well, I think somebody like him knows he's in the crosshairs, so I would assume he's very careful with things like that. And it's also funny that you say their methods, and I think there's definitely a point to be made there. And if they were going after a small business owner for serving underage minors, and actually, I kind of take that back now that I'm getting into my 30s, but and by I meant more like 20-year-old, not like a 15-year-old for posterity's sake there. But to the point, if he was using undercover journalism to expose petty crimes by like somebody who's just trying to make it, or like trying to catch, or like those gotcha shows that try to catch people in like racist situations or try to make them look foolish, that'd be one thing. But they have a tendency, and their method is to go after people in positions of power and authority, or at least people who work for powerful institutions. And it's all well and good to say that one, and I think especially if you're engaged in nefarious undertakings, then you should be exposed. And in addition to that, I also, like, in particular with the most recent one, it's like I go on, I'm single, so I go on dates, and I kind of make it a point to not talk about my work on a first date. And I would think it really, really weird if I'm sitting across from somebody and all they want to do is talk about what I do for work. And I would think that would be like a huge red flag for me. So it is funny to me the way these people will open up in these situations where, if you just put literally just a pretty face across the table.
Yeah, one thing you got to notice too about a lot of these accusations, they're often hard to prove and hard to, at the same time, hard to disprove. I mean, they never say anything like, well, he embezzled money or something like that. It's always one of these things that it seems like, it's like, and it's often vague. It's something like, well, that guy just really makes me uncomfortable. Okay, that can mean a whole lot of different things. And some people will, go into the worst case scenario as far as, the accusation of being difficult to work with. We've certainly heard that, about a lot of people who have made a
But
difference in this world.
well, it's
Certainly heard about
precisely that.
Steve Jobs.
Yeah. Yeah. People who are driven tend to be difficult to work for because they aspire to such a high demanding level. And it's, and I think there's it's not really, the truth of the matter is irrelevant, right? What matters is what you can convince the board of directors in this particular instance and what the donors do in response to it.
Yeah.
So that's where we're kind of, as far as like watching the story, we're just going to have to see what happens.
Yeah. I see some similarities here too, between at least with what happened with Young Americans for Liberty, and it's been completely neutered now. I mean, it's not what it used to be because they got a few people out of there.
Well, a lot of these organizations that are geared towards the collegiate market and who have a large donor class behind them, a lot of them have gone in a direction that is more, and here's the real question though. Is it that they've gone in a different direction, or was this always their direction? Because frankly, as far as I would analyze it, it's more to do with the corporate, and I'm using this word corporate in a vague but specific sense, which is to say the more corporate libertarian outlook and approach to an approach to change in society. Like, it's all well and good for everyone to learn about free markets, but we don't want to upset the apple cart too much because we have millions of dollars invested in various companies across the world, right? So it's like, and I think and I would also label this a generational element too, and it's the older generation that holds the wealth, especially in this case. And so there's a tendency with the older generation to not want to stir the pot because they like what they have, and then the people underneath, or the people coming up when they don't have as much are fine with it. It's all within that personal calculation. And so where I think a lot of the energy now is not behind a academic, dry, buttoned up kind of, well, we're going to give this rigorous defense of free market capitalism in within the university system, and that's going to be fair play. And it's changed to a message that realizes that the leftist infiltration, the Marxist infiltration of the universities is more or less complete, and it's now starting to creep out into the broader corporate world and in our daily lives and in the highest levels of government, as far as the baseline narrative. And so the nature of the game has changed in that regard. So I think that's where you're seeing the split, really. And that's where you look at organizations like Young Americans for Liberty or Students for Liberty, and you're kind of like, man, what are they really standing for? Or is what they're standing for the proper path forward?
Yeah, it's definitely something that happens. I call it mission drift, and sometimes it just doesn't happen, overnight. It's often very gradual, but you get to and I've been involved with organizations that I saw that happen with. I was involved with an organization back in 2014, and it seemed like it was something that could have gotten really big, and I think it could have been something as big as Toastmasters, and I still think it has that potential. But then some of the woke lefties came in and took it over, and it was just, they completely changed the culture and changed the vibe of the organization, that it was just not fun anymore. And the worst thing about it was, I really saw it as something that could have been really good for men and women and could have really bridged the gap between men and women, and maybe it's something that could have been really good for singles, and they completely made it into something that would be crap for singles. Because, it's like, I already, you used to be able to meet your wife at work, but now you can't even do that anymore. And now it's getting to this point where you can't meet your wife anywhere.
Yeah, I mean, this my philosophically speaking, in the pursuit of ideas, culture, ritual, myth, these sorts of things have always interested me. And I can remember reading as a, I read a lot as a kid. And so I would read like old books all the time, and you would read about like courtship and so on and so forth. And I think at this point, it is an almost unstated fact that there's something broken with our society's culture around dating and finding a spouse. And I think when you start to answer that question, what you eventually come to is you realize, well, the reality of the matter is there are powers, if you will, that work against that idea, right? We've seen over the past few years the popularization of what people entitle polyamory, right? Or the idea of ethical non-monogamy, right? And I think it's worth pointing out that the society or the culture doesn't actually promote monogamy. So why would you expect to find a wife anywhere, as it were? And so that's what makes it more difficult, I think, because there's a certain degree to which some people it works out for, other people need a little bit of extra help in that regard. And so that's where a society naturally comes in through their culture and rituals. And again, I kind of think with that our rituals are broken in that regard.
Yeah, the whole thing's broken down. I think it's interesting for me. I was born in 1971, and my parents were a lot older than I was. So I had parents and grandparents who grew up in the system when it basically worked. I mean, when it functioned, and then, but by the time I was, becoming a teenager, everything was starting to break down, and it's completely broken down now. I mean, the one thing about polyamory is I think there's this attitude that people are going to cheat anyway. So because at least polyamorous are honest about it, and it is better to be honest about it than to lie. I mean always what gets people cheating. It's not the fact that you went out and had sex, but it's the fact that you lied about having sex.
I don't know that I'd agree with
Yeah.
that, but we can
Well,
stay on that or move on.
yeah, but there's I think there's been somewhat of a breakdown too in just how people relate to one another, and not also. And I don't like to engage in generational stereotyping, but this country has extended childhood, and it's almost gotten to a point where teenagers 100 years ago might have been more mature than 20 somethings are now.
Sure.
I really hate making these generational, but and what really bothers me is this protected existence that kids are supposed to have now. I mean, my grandfather walked 2 miles to school each way as a first grader. Kids were out doing things and taking risks and living life. And they were actually, when you live this complete protected existence, you don't learn how to grow up. When kids would play baseball and they would self-organize and play baseball, they learned how to organize themselves. They learned empathy. But when it's just, you know, organized sports organized by the coaches or mom and dad, it's a completely different thing.
Yeah, but the kids don't raise themselves.
Yeah. And I
Right.
don't
I mean,
know.
like it's not a child's fault the way it was raised.
Yeah, it's not their fault. I agree. I don't know how we got into this, and I don't know how we get out of it. And of course, nowadays you can have the cops called on you if you let your kids walk to the post office when they're 7 years old or something like that. I
Well,
can remember going to the post office when I was 7.
sure.
You know,
Well, I mean, this has obviously been studied a great deal, and so there are people who have different ideas of as to why it occurs. But I think one through line has been, and especially one that's been more, let's say, exacerbated over the last decade or so, is just the general decline in societal trust. We've gone in the United States from a high trust society to a lower trust society, and so when you look at other lower trusts, but we've done that in the context of also being one of the most materially one of the most wealthy countries ever in existence, right? So it doesn't. So and you tend to and wealth tends to correlate, I think, a little bit towards a higher trust society in this regard. So we're seeing as we're witnessing a degeneration in that regard. Whether it's by design or accident, I guess, is an avenue of exploration. But to the specifics of child rearing, I think you certainly see, I certainly see, there's definitely a lot of people who raise their children well. I am one of those dastardly millennials that everybody likes to complain about. And we self-organized. I had organized sports, but we also self-organized. I was allowed to ride my bicycle around the neighborhood, and kind of do, and had that general freedom. But I didn't have an iPad that really gave me all the freedom that I wanted to begin with. And there's kind of just an element of that as well. The more digital and virtual our existence has become, that also has an effect on children. And we should then, and in consequence, we should expect that to affect politics as well. Um, in specific, what we might focus on is, we might look at an organization like Twitter, and Twitter 1.0, as I've been hearing it called. They talked a lot about safety, right? Like our safety team, our health and safety team, if memory serves. And what they meant by that at Twitter were the censors, right? They were the people who would put things down the memory hole. And so there's something to be said for being safe. In fact, we have a biological imperative to make sure that we're safe so that we can live as long as possible. But when we literally live in safety, right? For as bad as society is, you and I still live in relative comfort compared to most of human history. Um, there's something to be said for the fact that those natural impulses can be pathologized, and then I would argue reinforced by ideology, to create really bad outputs and real world bad effects.
Yeah, that's also been an issue. The whole I don't know what happened to the adage of sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. And it really that really sums it all up. And that was often the response you'd give somebody if they called you something. And nowadays I don't know. I don't know where that's come from, but yeah, it's very troubling. And the and words are what separate. Words and language are what make this animal human. I mean, the lions don't talk, the monkeys don't talk, the dogs and cats don't talk. They don't negotiate. But we've managed to achieve this, and it's one of the great accomplishments of the species. And if you're going to throw that out, you have talk or you have violence. You don't have a third option. And if you're against talk, you are for violence.
Yeah, and I think a lot, but the idea that most people are like the Three Musketeers, the rapier, right? Like that kind of that weapon that was popular in like the Renaissance. It's got the
Yeah.
covered. It's almost, the hilt is almost completely covered around the hand, and it's a long, thin sword, similar to what you would see today in a modern foil fencing match. Like that style of sword became popular at the height of at one of the flourishings of human civilization. And the reason is that basically you had all these guys going around, and they needed a sword that they could fight each other in alleys with, right? When they came across the rival clan or guild or something of that nature. So like the pretense that I would argue the pretense that humans aren't, that humans don't have a violent nature is an artificial consequence of a nursery rhyme that's fed that people choose to buy into, right? Like it's yes, words and violence, and the question is, but like it's always been words or violence, and really it's always just been violence at the end
Yeah.
of the day. Like the idea that words are actually going to solve things is a fairly new development or it's a fairly new idea. And then turns out you can say that all you want, but at the end of the day, when at the end of the day, you can talk, and if somebody punches your lights out, well, you shut up pretty quickly, don't you?
Yeah, that's certainly true. Yeah, I agree. It is a fairly new idea. But it also, violence has also become a lot more costly. Our violence is now at the point where we could all we could wipe out the entire planet if we wanted to.
Oh, sure. Yeah, we have the technological capability to wage destruction on a massive scale as a species, as a collective species. Yeah.
And I think we have, I personally think we have, enough. I mean, if we really wanted to, we could support 100 billion people on this planet. I really believe that. We could grow enough food, we could have enough housing. It might be kind of tight, and I'm not saying that's a desired goal, but there's no reason, there's nothing to gain. There's really nothing to gain by being violent. But except for some reason, it seems to make people feel good. But,
well,
yeah.
I think it might be interesting to narrow down on what you mean by violence in this context, because like I think you can say that, but if a little bit of quote unquote violence can wield me a huge reward, then that's a strategy of success. It's not a virtue. When we can say it's not a virtuous one, but that doesn't mean it's not a strategy for success. If you understand what I mean.
But then you've created a situation where you constantly have to live in a world where you just have to protect your ill-gotten gains from the next violent person who comes along.
But I mean, we have right, and we have a corollary of that. Like we have the corollary of that within what we might call peaceful society, right?
Yeah.
Like business is a way, commerce and business is a way of engaging in exchange, right? Like you said, trade, and I think some yeah, but trade is more unique amongst humans, but there are like offerings amongst different species, especially in regards to like mating rituals and stuff. Which you could consider to be some form of exchange or a demonstration of really a demonstration of prowess and value.
Yeah, there's prostitution among other animals. They found that too.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I think that. Yeah, but not to get too far off the point. But I think what I'm pushing back against, I think here, and I don't know that we're necessarily in disagreement about it, is again the veneer is the belief that humans are really peaceful creatures deep down. I think a lot of humans are, but humans being such a complex species and a complex creature, we're not just one thing, right? Like rabbits are just kind of one thing. There might be some variance in personality between breeds or between individual rabbits that people who pay close attention can determine, but rabbits in general, like they're not a complex species. They don't have complex social hierarchies or anything like that. Humans, on the opposite side, do, which means that there can be many paths to evolutionary success that a complicated species like that can exhibit. And I think, and again, that's what I'm pushing back against, because there's this story that's kind of told that people buy into one way or another, that it's really, violence is just this anti-human thing. And I just don't think that's the case. And I think, and again, it's by what means, right? To the point today, people would expand the term violence to mean words. So obviously that word is nebulous in its implementation and usage.
And and I think that's really just a way to legitimize, to make violence legitimate again. I do not believe that Homo sapiens are necessarily peaceful or violent beings. I think they're volitional beings. I think they and just the same way I wouldn't necessarily say that they're smart or dumb, but they certainly have a choice, and they have a choice to be rational as well, but they don't really make that choice either.
Well, it's a bell. Like we know intelligence is a bell curve.
Yeah.
So in some cases it actually is the fact that like their impulse control is not there.
Yeah.
And that's where society, so to speak, and I'm using the word society purposefully here, right? A society, peaceful society, if you will, they're supposed to be there to reinforce those norms and to push people in the best direction you can. What we continually witness in our current day is the opposite of that, right? Looking very easily at this situation that we have on the West Coast, where like retail theft under $1,000 isn't something that you can get in trouble for. So what's the consequence? The consequence is that people walk into stores and they walk away with thousands of dollars of merchandise, and and eventually companies are going to pull out of those areas, and it's going to become more expensive for people to live, which is going to have a negative reinforcement effect
Yeah,
on the community.
exactly. And that's certainly a huge problem in my view that you can't even, uh,
And
and after the last, I've largely come to the conclusion that a lot of Homo sapiens are violent, but they want to engage in some type of righteous violence.
we don't have to be violent.
Like,
It's
like,
it's not
like
it's
the,
not
yeah,
yeah, it's like it's not a matter of, I don't think it's virtuous to go around just beating everybody up, but you said like there's no earlier you
yeah.
kind of said something to the effect of like there was no way of justifying it, but of course everybody recognizes the validity of self-defense, right?
But yeah, I recognize the validity of self defense, but you look at the people who look at the one, all the American citizens or citizens around the world who supported the violent COVID policies, the violent, they wanted to, the people got vaccinated, they wanted to be violent toward the non-vaccinated,
Yeah, but why?
or they want, and it's almost like they wanted to have something to feel good about or something like that.
Well, everybody wants to have something to feel good about. But this is the thing, like why? Why is it? Well, the reason why is because because the media and the highest levels of government pushed out a narrative that purposefully demonized people that disagreed with the
Yeah,
dominant orthodoxy. And right? Like that's why. It's not that people just decided one day to start hating people because they made a slightly different medical decision than the other person. No. They did it because they were told to hate people. Most people do what they're told. And
yeah,
that's why it's so important. That's what's the old adage, show me your friends, I'll show you your future. It's the same
yeah,
principle at play. It's all, it's the same
yeah,
kind of thing. People look, we're beings who look for answers, and because and going, you made the point about language, because we have such a complex way of formulating language and writing down language in particular. um One of the consequences of that is we can like skip over a lot of stuff, and so we can input information culturally that would take that much longer to code genetically, if you will. um and so to, and so to the point that that capacity can be hijacked, and it can be hijacked with bad ideas. And that, I mean, and so that's how I look at it. I don't see, the average person is just doing what they think is right in that regard. Now you and I might come from a subculture that had a predisposed skepticism towards government action, and that just helped us see things a little more clearly. But that was something that was learned. That's not inherent. If you're never presented with the information and you have no particular interest, like even just having a conversation like this, before we started recording, you were just saying, we were talking about how, like, just the honest exchange of ideas, that itself is a marginal thing as well. Now it has utility, but it exists in the margins. To pretend that, and to pretend that everybody is going to be interested in a conversation like this, or that everybody is going to be like, I call that the egalitarian delusion, right? I think that's something that that you could, if you want to argue, started with the best of intentions, but it really has some danger. It's had some dangerous effects the more people believe that to be 100% true, because it's just not, right? Thomas Sowell, I think, does the best work of this in his book Discriminations and Disparities, of teasing out this egalitarian delusion that's rife in modern politics, and libertarianism included, for that matter. And frankly, even objectivism, since I know you have a bit of an objectivist bent. Like you said, people can choose to be rational. I think there's some sense in which that's accurate, but I don't think in every case that it is, right? And I think in fact people do choose to be rational. And the rational thing most of the time is to keep your head down and keep swimming with the herd, because then you don't stand out.
yeah. There's definitely a lot of debate about nature versus nurture. I mean, I wonder, do you think you think O'Keefe's going to stick around with Project Veritas, or what happens with all this?
I think in particular, going back to the James O'Keefe story, that if he really does get ousted, I would hope that means that their donors dry up and that they would follow him to his next venture. Certainly, he's built up enough of a following that I think he would be okay. The question
Yeah.
is, what kind of contractual obligations would he have, and up to and including a non-compete?
Yeah.
So that would be interesting. I'm personally, given the fact that he hasn't come out, because of how media savvy he is, I'll make the prediction that there's going to be some serious lawfare that goes on with this. Here's the problem with that. That means instead of doing gotcha journalism, fine, you can belittle it if you will, but instead of going out and looking and investing time and resources into exposing fraud and corruption, which is their stated mission, instead of doing that, they're going to be doing legal battles to control the money. And if that continues to 2024, that has enough of that right there could sway an election. Right?
Yeah.
Like look what Twitter did before the 2020 election with the Hunter Biden story. So we have to view all of these things within the political sphere, which is, if going back to something we were just circling around, it has been called violence by other means. It's the closest we come to outright violence within a civil society, let's say, without actually coming to blows most of the time. Or at least it's the attempt at that.
Well, that, the violence by other means, I mean, that's the thing, when you live in a society that's this litigious as it is. I mean, most business owners fear, they fear the regulators, but they fear some stupid lawsuit even more. I mean, it's just, so much of what, you talk about high trust versus low trust society. I mean, there's no trust when you have to feel like you're always worried about, well, who's going to sue me for what, even though I, put forth my best effort and did the best possible work I could do. It's so crazy on that sense. I do think it's, it does show the dangers, of maybe even going to a nonprofit and having a board. I mean, I don't know what the actual organizational structure of Tim Pool's company is, but I think he's a company, and I think he pretty much owns it. So there's no way to throw him out, as far as I know. Is that correct?
As far as I understand it, yeah. And I think you point out you point out something valid. I've actually, in the back of my mind, there's this thing that's sticking in that I can't quite get to stop popping up, which is thinking about the effects of the targeting from the IRS under the Obama administration against Tea Party and other right-wing groups, right? And basically breaking the 501c3 tax, basically making it really, really difficult, unless you're one of these big corporate entities that can maintain the cash flow for these nonprofits. Because as I learned in my short amount of time volunteering within them, there's a lot of money in these nonprofits, and people are collecting very nice salaries. And in some cases, I'm sure it's well deserved, but it's just kind of worth pointing out. And I've explored it myself. I've explored it myself as far as like doing it, because, oh, cool, nonprofits, you get tax benefits, but it's actually kind of expensive to start a nonprofit. It's far easier to just start your own sole proprietorship LLC or an LLC. And then, to the point, when you get, as you progress as you grow, it maintains under your control, your direction, your vision. Going back, another organization that's a nonprofit is Reason Magazine. And we've kind of seen how their coverage has shifted and changed over the years, and how they've kind of, in my estimation, they've lost the energy, right? They've lost a connection to any sort of like groundswell or what's coming next, which is what I'm personally interested in.
Yeah, it is very interesting. Sometimes I think, maybe these organizations just run out of momentum. They get stuck in doing things one way and don't really change. It's hard to say. I mean, I worked 2 years for a nonprofit, and I enjoyed it in a lot of ways. I won't say we were rolling in money. We were more of a social service organization, but you definitely have some benefits. Microsoft, for example, got into helping out nonprofits big time, and we could buy things like a Microsoft Office license for $20.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, a regular business, it'll cost, what, $400 or $500. So we had little benefits like that. It was you do get some of those benefits. There's a lot of
And I'm sure, and I should say there are plenty of nonprofits that do good work. This is specific to the political sphere and nonprofits that are engaged in political activism. And there's so much extra red tape that you have to go through. And kind of to the point of what you were hinting at before, it creates this board that that means you don't actually have control of the organization you started. And so if you're a creator and if you're somebody with a vision, that's something that I think you should take into account before you go and start that. And I think that's why you see a lot more people, especially with the tools available, trying to go at it alone. And in fact, but that in itself presents another problem, because there's something to be said for like the network effect. And so when people come together, that's why a place like the Daily Wire, for whatever else you might say about them, is such a they have so much influence in the sphere, is because they're large and they have a lot of money behind them, and they can invest in the type of infrastructure that's needed to do so. Right, or that becomes of that sort of thing, and that's different from being an independent creator who doesn't necessarily have a specialization in like marketing or something like that.
Yeah, and it's definitely hard. You sometimes do get beholden to certain people though, and you have to go a certain way. I think the Daily Wire, that's also a for-profit company, right? Too, or
yeah,
they're not. Yeah,
I think they might have a PAC, but yeah, they're a for-profit company.
Yeah, it's very interesting, and I think if we just simplified the taxes and all that stuff, we'd get rid of a lot of these problems. I mean, I wonder what it was like to start a nonprofit 150 years ago. It was probably very different.
Well, you didn't have the category.
Yeah.
I think the whole like nonprofit thing is is maybe the 70s.
But even among corporations, you can remember when Apple fired Jobs back in the 80s, or when these are for-profit companies, or when Southwest Airlines fired Lamar Muñiz, who was their first CEO. If you want to read a good book about business, it's hard to find, but read Lamar Muñiz's book Southwest Passage. I mean, that guy left so many legacies with Southwest Airlines that made the company profitable for 20 years after he left there. That guy did an amazing job there. But so just it's like you have a board, and one problem too is you have people in a position who are making decisions and have power, but I don't really think there are any consequences for making bad decisions. Who gets punished on a board?
Well, I mean,
what
constitutes a bad decision?
What incentive is there to be a good board member?
Well, I mean, do you get a stipend? And then and then also, there's plenty of examples of people who sit on boards who have the best interests of the institution at heart. Right? Like, it's not to say that everybody's nefarious. It is to say that there's an oversampling of nefarious people within the political sphere, because of the risk reward profile in that regard, right? Again, like we don't actually know what's going on yet. There hasn't been too much public. There's been a lot of speculation, a lot of leaked documents, but we don't actually know what the final results are or what the final results will be. So I think and that's why I said, so it's either, maybe it's just pure greed. Maybe they just want to get rid of somebody who is who's like hoarding the money like a dragon, and so they can kind of pay themselves better and make sure that their cousin or nephew gets hired, so he has a nice resume, right? You can kind of you could like I said before, like, some of their stories aren't anything. They could just focus on like more puff piece that just give red meat to people who get pissed off at the lefties and stuff like that, right? Like that's a working business model that works for pretty much every conservative commentator over the age of like 70 or 50, whatever. You know what I mean? Like, just the fear porn, like people like the older generations, no offense, the boomers and the Xers, a lot of them love their fear porn, and Project Veritas does a good job of presenting their information, which kind of has that dramatic effect. And that's why it has impact when it's so important. And again, they could just do with the brand that exists, they could hypothetically do low nothing that rocks the boat, but something that still brings in enough revenue to where everybody makes a little bit of money, and then we can all go home happy. But the story that I'm hearing, right, is that what you have is somebody like James O'Keefe, who is driven, for whatever else you will say about the man, driven to expose what he sees to be lies on the part of people in power, and I tend to agree with him in that regard. And so somebody like that doesn't care about the money. They're moved by something beyond the strict materialism of the thing. And that's why that's why he's such a popular figure. But there's always going to be somebody. It doesn't at any point, there's always going to be somebody in those types of places lurking in the shadows, wanting to take power from themselves, because power is something that because status and fame and our place and a better place in the hierarchy of society is something we all innately crave as human beings. There's nothing wrong with that. Understanding ourselves at the instinctual level is important. And then and that's why we have to use our faith and our reason to harmonize between those elements to be the best person that we can. At least that's the way I look at it. But there's a lot of people who give into, we might say, their more pathological nature, or who are just pathological.
Well, it can also just be, somebody has a different agenda from James and they want to, do that. It's
there's nothing wrong with Project Veritas becoming just like every other right-wing think tank that just puts out puff pieces. Those places still generate millions of dollars in donations. So it could just be that. It could be, well, man, we're exposing ourselves a lot. What if we make a mistake one day? Or it could be infiltration of one kind or another, whether that's infiltration of, what will we say, establishment, or just outright left-wing influence. Again, we don't know. That's speculation.
Yeah. Sometimes, organizations go from, you imagine a football game, you go out there in the first half, you want to try to score, you want to try to play well, you want to try to build up a big lead. Then when you go out in the second half, you've already got this big lead. You focus more on just, trying to get the game over with. And so you're maybe playing more not to lose than not to win. And I think after a while you get to that point where you're playing not to lose instead of playing to win.
Right.
Which,
Well, and like, to your football metaphor, if you're not careful and you don't recalibrate, and the other team starts coming at you, and you become lazy, right? There's now playing a tactical strategy that maintains a defense and pushes off and still generates enough offense, but isn't necessarily pushing everybody to its limit. That's actually executing at a pretty high level. It's when you get lazy and you let people get by you that you then could eventually blow a lead, as it were, and then lose the game.
oh yes, exactly. And you do see teams lose because they go conservative and like that. I hope this works out. I mean, sometimes it can just be an energy mismatch when you get when you get somebody who's really enthusiastic and you get a bunch of other people who don't really care. The people who don't really care tend to get mad at the person who's really enthusiastic. You need, and I don't know I don't even know how many people work for Veritas, but it's probably covered that enough for now. You sometimes call yourself a post-libertarian. What is post-libertarianism, and what 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 holes is post-libertarianism trying to fill that you don't think libertarianism is filling?
So I still maintain there isn't a post-libertarianism. I wrote about this in the Post-Libertarian Moment. If you go to post-libertarianmoment.com, that should take you to the page on my Substack that has the essay and all the podcasts that I've done covering this. What I defined, I define it as a moment, not a movement. The moment and the moment was realizing, and this was a personal moment that I felt, but it was something I think felt by a lot of people who were within the libertarian space. And so I defined it as it's the moment when a libertarian realizes that, what was it? I should have it pulled up, but basically that liberty isn't a popular concept. It's not something that you're going to get 51% of the population to agree to. And in fact, thinking that you need to do that is itself a buying into the egalitarian delusion, I would argue. It's realizing that in the light of lockdown policies, right, in the light of the pandemic, we realized that most people really weren't committed to this idea of liberty the way we conceptualized it in terms of property rights and a general freedom. That was not people's highest priority. And so when you realize that, I think you have to recalibrate. Now, the problem with that, and why I don't think the subculture has been able to recalibrate, is because a certain portion of them, and again, I'm speaking specifically where I come from, like listening to people like Tom Woods and Dave Smith and Lou Rockwell, um, in particular, in the Dave Smith and then, with Michael Heiss and the Mises Caucus, is suddenly it's not enough that you're a small L libertarian, right? Like Ron Paul. Now you have to be a big L libertarian, or you're not a libertarian anymore. I mean, that was really the crux of the disagreements that were occurring. Now there's been I'm not trying to belittle some of the philosophical differences in the spiritual direction that some of the people who are involved in that have taken, and certainly myself, my perspective on things has evolved in light of this. But that's precisely what I called for in the essay, and I'd encourage people to read it because I think it does hold true. And it basically states it's basically recognizing the political truism that in our winner-take-all system, two parties tend to dominate. So third-party politics is not worth it. That was pretty much the main thrust of my piece and defining the moment. What's come afterwards, I challenge anybody to show any kind of coherence. To the extent that there's any coherence, you could call it Christian, but that's not new, and that's certainly not post-libertarianism. That's just that would just be a return to the Father, right? And I don't view that as a bad thing personally. But I don't think it's new. And I think the fact that people have tried to tag it as an ism, I used to run away from it. Now I just kind of I make reference to it. I would say it has far more to do with a post-liberalism than it does with a libertarianism, right? And that's really how I conceptualize it now. Excuse me. Is this turning? I would argue, is this turning of an age and entering into a post-liberal space? And what does that look like? And that's why I've changed the tag of my website to for what comes next in politics, because we're not moving beyond politics. As much as I wanted that to be the case, 2020 showed me that that's not happening anymore. And so if we're not moving beyond politics, and it's time to roll up our sleeves and play the game, if that's how you're inclined. Now, me personally, I do it in more of an analyst and in a media sense of trying to shape ideas and trying to present complicated ideas in a way that people can understand. But but that's diff. But I don't think that getting into third party politics is really the best use of people's time. And certainly, I didn't think it wasn't worth my time.
Yeah, I've never heard anybody say that you're not a libertarian if you're not involved with the Libertarian Party. If you've heard that, I'm very sad to hear that. But there are a lot of people out there that I think are doing good libertarian work that aren't involved with the Libertarian Party.
Yeah, but you would agree that, I mean, it's just a question of, I think what ended up happening and why I kind of wrote the piece was because with a lot of the stuff that was being said by guys like Pete, guys like Mark, guys like Andrew, guys like Matt, guys like Buck, a lot of that stuff that they were saying, it some of it rang true and some of it didn't. And so I wanted to understand what they were talking about. And really, I will say that here's what I say. Here's what I'll say. I think the libertarian prescription to the post World War II order is out of date. That doesn't mean that Austrian economics isn't worth your time of study, right? It also doesn't mean that Austrian economics is all you need to understand to know the world. At the beginning of Human Action, Mises talks about that the philosopher could learn from the economist, and I would just gently nudge and remind people that just because you've studied economics doesn't mean you have a full understanding of everything. As it's the Dunning-Kruger effect. It's the humility. You have to have epistemic humility and understand that you don't know things. Really, you can try your best, but you should always keep an open mind. I'm not saying. I would say other things have kept me from really. I would say at this point, it's just not wanting to identify with with that set of ideas. I'd rather people think of me as somebody with an interesting perspective or somebody that they can rely on in their personal lives than I am with somebody thinking of me as a libertarian, as it were. That doesn't mean that if we were going to go tit for tat on policy descriptions, we wouldn't have a lot of agreement. But I think there's a larger direction. And I don't think that, and again, going back to where I started, libertarians aren't going to be 51%, which means you have to ally. I'm sure I'm exaggerating a little bit, but I mean, there's been, I guess, at the big anti-war rally, there's going to be like Marxists and stuff. Listen, that's my whole a lot of my intellectual journey has been combating the evils of communism because of my family's background. So I don't really like it. For me, I'm far more willing to sit down across the table from the often maligned constitutional conservative than I am with somebody who's an avowed Marxist, even if they're a pleasant person. So it's like it's always about who are your show me your friends, I'll show you your future. And the incentive structure of third party politics, I think, is is just wrong, and people should really stop doing that.
Again, I can see where you're coming from. I mean, uh, you know, there are some, different ways to pursue politics. For example, single issue politics. I mean, yeah, I mean, certainly the people who have worked to get marijuana legalized. I mean, they just go out and say, "Hey, let's get marijuana legalized," and you end up with a lot of different people there with different perspectives, and as long as everybody's just talking about their shared goal, everybody's happy. But then you part ways and go home and say, "Okay, well, we all fought this battle, and now we're going home." So, yeah, I don't know if it's really tough for me too. I don't know if
Well, but
anybody is ever
wouldn't you
going to.
agree though that the political landscape has shifted a little bit, and it's not really about issues like marijuana legalization, or like license or like licensure reform? And maybe that's a difference in perspective, but like from where I sit, I do buy into the idea that there are broader, larger questions that have to be answered. Um, that have to be answered and fought for beyond just like a narrow victory within just like a narrow margin of victory of single issue. And again, if single issue is your thing, I'm a big picture guy, obviously, right? Like philosophy, ideas. I'm all about the lofty idea. So I don't want to sound like I'm denigrating people like the 10th Amendment Center who do good like legislative action, but like that's the model, right? Again, a lot of my criticism had eventually what it really had to do, and as I sit back in retrospect, had far more to do with third party politics and also with the dogmatic tendency within humanity, but specifically as I encountered it within the libertarian subculture that I found myself a part of.
I'm not sure what dogmatic subculture you're talking about, but I've also noticed that for a lot of cases, that's how the left has operated for a long time. Though they focus on a single issue here or there, and then once they achieve their goal, they basically forget about it. I mean, as people have told me, it said, the left used to care about gay men, and they don't really care at all about gay men anymore, and they don't really care about gays. Now they just care about transgender, and they'll go on these other little crusades, like to get plastic bags outlawed in Austin and stuff like that. And it's just they've always going on these little crusades here and there, and then once they feel like they accomplish a goal with one crusade, they go on a crusade somewhere else. I mean, sometimes single. I mean, and when you do single issues like that over a period of 20 years, you've made a huge difference.
Well, I mean, that's the long march. Yeah, right. You're right. But that's the difference between the left and the right. Is the left is actually united in movement. The right is just united in opposition. There really isn't any unity in movement, which is why you see the fracturing that you do. And I do think I'm not that this isn't to say that there aren't subdivisions within the left, but it is to say that I think they're more pronounced within the right, with at least within America, because there is no solid movement against it. Um, why I haven't quite fleshed that out, but I can at least identify that.
Well, the right doesn't seem to know what they're for, and people who know what they're for tend to win over people who don't seem to know what they're for. And
Well,
that's
I think there's differences in what the various elements that constitute the right,
but
what they are actually for.
but I also very much agree that since the end of World War II, the only thing that conservatives ever really cared about was spending as much money as possible on the military, and that's still about the only other issue they care about. Although another issue that's gotten big for them now is hating immigrants.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on who you talk to. I found that people will say, we need to close the borders in one breath, and then say, but Jose's pretty great. He works for us, and we helped him get our citizenship. And, it's like, I mean, like, hating immigrant. I don't know. That's the kind of like charged rhetoric I think is a little. I mean, you can use it, and but it's like, what I think what people are actually like, you talked about the military spending. Well, why? Because defense is a good thing, right? Most people who are, and then a lot of people in powerful positions tell me that I need to spend more money that we need to spend more money on the military. So of course I'm going to listen to them, because they're people in positions of power and authority. It's like, and again, and so the same thing is, people turn it on, and they turn on the news, and they see people crossing the border, and they know people can come here, and they know that it's because they know that it's based that basically people are abusing the asylum system, and they see an injustice in that. And you see that same sentiment expressed among legal immigrants as well, right? Like, this is a common talking point, but it's pretty expensive to move to the United States. And I'll just make one more point, which is, I travel to Mexico with some frequency for work, and in a small regional airport that I was in, there's this lovely little diagram that talks about that has this like ranchero wearing like a big sombrero hat, and like a big poncho with the Mexican flag, and then there's this prim and proper, like gray-haired abuelita looking character who's like the teacher. And basically the ranchero is sitting there, and he's like, oh, hey man, all these Central Americans are coming here, and they're taking our jobs. And then the the teacher, the maestra, comes in, and she's like, no, 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 you don't understand. This is all the benefits that immigration has for us. So it's like that's the same phenomenon is experienced cross culturally. So it's like, so I look at those things as wedge issues that politicians use to divide a population, and that's the game of democracy, especially within what is like really a uniparty system like we have, where there's an establishment interest that that dominates the central government, right? And so people are put into something like that. Again, I'm not denying hatred, and I'm not denying that people say mean things, but like, I'm saying that people say mean things cross culturally, and there's nothing like unique to the American the American conservative. And I didn't mean to go on a rant there, but I think it's something worth expounding upon, because and I believe this, by the way, about my about people across the aisle, as it were, on the left, right? I think in my pursuit of the pursuit of ideas is one thing, and I'll rigorously defend my position. Don't you mistake that for a second. But at an individual level, I try to focus on finding the good in people, and I do believe that you can find that in everybody. And that's the sad thing about politics dividing us. But again, that doesn't mean that it isn't time to stand up against the excesses of the excesses of leftism, because I look at it as a dangerous force for the stabilization of society.
Well, I think the left is a lot more hateful than the right. Uh, you know, and the only way to keep people unified is to take things out of the political realm. I mean, we have a unified country with where we have Baptists, we have Methodists, we have Lutherans, we have Church of Christ, we have Mormons, we have Catholics, we have non-believers, we have Jews. And one of the reasons why we're all able to live together is because we don't have any state religion. We've separated religion from politics, and that's how you have stability there.
Right.
The more
But I would
things you
argue that we
separate
don't
things
have
from
that.
politics is the more stability you're going to have. You're going to argue we don't separate religion from politics?
I don't I know. Yeah, I mean, I think the woke ideology is a religion unto itself.
Yeah, yes, yes. Okay, totally agree with that. I mean, that's not what, yeah, although that's not necessarily what we think of as a religion, but yes, it is another more, or it's even more like a cult, but yes, you're right about that.
Yeah, I would say,
And that's why we're divided, is because now this has become a state religion.
yeah, and even but before it, you also had a general Christian identity as well. I mean, even you could, yes, amongst the various denominations, but there was a broader Christian ethic and sentiment that that informed the creation of the country, I would argue, in many respects.
I think I definitely, I won't deny that Christianity had an influence on America's founding, although there were many different sects here of Christianity.
Yeah, and particularly
many of the
states
many of the states had established churches at the time.
Right, because that was the custom and the norm. I really, I would say, going back to my point of post-liberalism, right, versus a post-libertarianism, because post-libertarianism is just anathema, but the idea of moving beyond the liberal world order, right, and what does that look like? And again, that's where I think we are. I don't think we're in a position where we need to argue the specifics of licensure. I think we're at the point of realizing that this liberal experiment is kind of coming to a crashing end.
Yeah.
So we should figure out how to look at it next. And one of those points I think of recognizing is to the extent that you can separate church and state is just a formal distinction. Because as beings, we are just as much beings, I would argue, beings of faith and emotionality as we are these rational creatures. And I think in fact most of what animates us is what I would talk about in terms of faith, which is the things that we take for granted, because again, we can't know everything for certain. So that's like a hack that we have, right? It's an evolutionary adaptation. We don't have to have perfect knowledge of a situation in order to in order to come up with a solution for it, right? You can kind of just muddle through and figure things out. That was that kind of broke down at the end, but do you understand where I was going?
I'm not quite understanding where you're going now.
Okay, so is okay. My point. Sorry. So my point. So I talk about my critique of the Enlightenment, as it were, is that Enlightenment philosophy focused on the bifurcation of instinct and reason. Right. If you read most of the Enlightenment philosophers, they're going to talk about that. I think that they were mistaken in not only, and to the extent that we can downplay instinct and upplay reason, right, and maximize that across the society, we can create a better society. That was at least part of the Enlightenment idea. There was another strain of Enlightenment thought that looks at civilization as the actual downplay, and like civilization forming the man itself, right? So then eventually that's at least according to Stephen Hicks, that's how you eventually get like a Marxist perspective, which says that everything is determined by society, and the communist man can be a fisherman in the morning, a philosopher in the afternoon, and something else in the evening time, whatever he wants, and like really people aren't like that. There was this idea that if you change society, another one would be Thomas Sowell's constrained and unconstrained vision of man, right? The communist view of man, or the Marxist views man, is unconstrained. He has no nature. He is only what society makes of him. Whereas the constrained vision of man says the man has a nature, and we have to understand that and create an incentive structure around such a thing. This is to say that the mistake was to think of things in terms of separation between instinct and reason, because we are beings that also incorporate an element of faith into everything we do. Faith is taking something for granted without proof, right? In that understanding.
Yeah.
And it's the interplay between this ability. This is my formulation. It's the interplay between faith, instinct, and reason that gives us what we are as a being. And so and we see echoes of this, I think, in like evolutionary theory. But so to the point of the separation between church and state, while it may have had the best of intentions, turns out you can't actually do it, right? Like the new atheists claim that if we remove religion from the people, that this won't be a problem. There's a documentary you can watch called the Death of Stalin, or Stalin's Funeral. It has no commentary, and it's just 2 hours of footage from the Soviet Union of Stalin's funeral processions that happened all over. You watch that, and you explain to me how that's not still ritualism and religion as we would see it, and that was atheistic, right? So
I'm
atheism doesn't get rid of religion or a religious impulse itself. It just becomes another belief system, right? South Park. What is it? The United Atheist League versus the United Atheist Alliance, and they're arguing over the proper formulation, which one's most logical. There's always going to be something to argue about. There's always going to be something that causes division.
Well, yeah. I'm not. I do not. I certainly do not believe that the communists of the Soviet Union were really atheists. But atheism is deification of, but separation of the state. The separation of church and state is very, very different from the deification of the state.
Right, but my point was that it's a formal distinction only. It's just on a piece of paper.
But it's almost like you seem to think that the separation of church and state inevitably leads to the deification of the state, and I don't think that has to happen.
No, my point is that we deify. Period. You can't remove deification from the human experience.
Well, and so
that's why your faith should be in something.
Question, yeah. I'm wondering about, this is something I've been wondering about a lot lately. Even though I haven't, considered myself a Catholic in a long time, though, is that religion does serve as this, this better bacteria that keeps the much more dangerous bacteria away. And then when you do remove Christianity, something else comes in and fills the void, and it does become this.
But as well as I do that there's good bacteria and bad bacteria.
What? Yeah.
Right? Like there's good bacteria and bad bacteria. So
and like something, and like Christianity, which
is a good bacteria. It promotes growth.
Christianity, while it's not perfect, it certainly has,
Christians aren't perfect.
Yeah,
right?
It certainly
Christ is perfect. Yeah. That's the idea.
It certainly does serve, though, as this thing that kept other things from coming in, and I also consider Jesus a libertarian. I really do. But I would also ask too, and this has been my question for all of the people I know who call themselves Christians. Your church, most of you, your church is completely sold out in March of 2020. They completely rolled over and played dead.
Yeah.
And how can you possibly expect me to believe that, considering your behavior in March of 2020? And this is not unusual. The priest coddling the tyrant is nothing unusual, whether it be coddling Mussolini, coddling Hitler, coddling Francisco Franco. That, when the enemy of freedom takes power in the country or in the city or whatever, the priest is right there with him saying, yes, destroy freedom, destroy civilization.
That's not true. There are many, because Catholic priests in particular were sent to concentration camps.
What percentage of Catholic priests in Nazi Germany?
I Jesus. All right.
I acknowledge completely that they exist.
Catholics that stood, and there were many Catholic priests, because first off, you have to remember that the Germans were Lutheran. They were the people who started the Protestant Reformation, right? Yes. So they were the ones who broke away from Christendom, and moreover, the Catholic priests stood against the regime, and they were sent to, and they were part of the classes that were sent to concentration camps.
Although it was partially the Catholic Center Party that gave Hitler the Enabling Act, not to mention the Cardinal in Austria.
80% of the Catholic clergy and 5 bishops of Warthego were sent to the concentration camps in 1939. That's Wikipedia. I can dig a little bit more into this.
Yeah,
Catholic martyrs of the Holocaust. Catholics are constantly confronted with Again, this isn't necessarily.
I could look that up. I could look that up.
But the Nazi regime wasn't Christian.
You can also talk about the White Rose. But let's face it, Hans and Sophie Scholl. For every Hans and Sophie Scholl, there were 100 Germans who would have sucked Hitler's dick if they could have.
Yeah, I wasn't sure. I wasn't arguing anything for the Nazis.
That's the thing too. We learned in 2020. We also learned why the Germans worshipped Hitler, why they would have crawled across broken glass to kiss his feet, and why they were all saying "My Führer, my Führer." I mean, it's
right. Yeah.
I mean,
Right.
you know,
People were faced with the brutal reality of humanity, that we're not these perfect creatures. Again, if you want, I mean, like, here's the reality. If you want to talk about criticisms of the church, yeah, I have them. That
yeah,
doesn't mean that I don't but it's not just
yeah,
about the institution, it's about the people.
yeah.
And so, and
Yeah,
now to the extent that people are interested in this idea, I encourage you to look at my series with Andrew from Popular Liberty on Twitter, where we've gone through Bishop Lvov's. They have uncrowned him,
yeah,
which precisely takes to task the idea that separation between church and state is a noble or good thing. Certainly, and basically you could interpret the horrors of 20th century governments, which were removed from their religious tethers, as being the most destructive in human history, the most destructive of which being the communists, which specifically did reject, if you don't want to say religion, then certainly Christianity.
oh
And
yeah,
I think,
it definitely rejected Christianity. I
and
don't
they
believe it
and they
rejected
rejected
religion.
religion altogether, but they still had to replace that within the society. And that's what I
I
mean when I say you can say that there's a separation between church and state, but the people that are participating in your democratic system are still individuals who are moved by ideas and what they believe, and not necessarily a rational justification of the
yeah,
world.
yeah.
That's my point.
Yeah, yes, the communists definitely rejected Christianity, but I don't believe at all that they rejected religion. They were just creating their own religion. You know,
I think that's kind of like a little trick that atheists use to try and like maintain their point, like the new atheist movement use, and most of the time. I think it was very clear that Marx eschewed a religion. I think it was very clear that people like Lenin didn't appreciate religion, but what they understood was how to control a population. Just like our government understands how to control a population, because we saw a rise in the field of mass psychology, what later,
yeah,
what we know today is like propaganda and advertising. So
yeah,
like, right? So we understood, and they're tools to control, because at the end of the day, we're social beings. We're beings that live within a society. A society is determined by its culture. A culture is its ritual beliefs and practices.
yeah, and one of the and I do think one of the failures of the libertarian movement is that they have not studied these techniques at all. These techniques of call it social manipulation, social engineering, or whatever. I think it's something that libertarians, if they learned, would definitely do better to learn. Maybe they wouldn't be successful anyway, but they completely reject any of those tools and just say we have to try to reason with these people, and it's like you're not doing that. I mean, it would it'd be like a bunch of libertarians going down to Mexico and giving all their speeches in English. And then they'd wonder, well, why aren't they listening to us?
Yeah, I
Uh,
mean, I'm
because
in the
you're not
business.
because you're speaking English instead of Spanish.
Well, there's also, I mean, there are people who, a lot, like we said before we go on, and I've talked about that. Like in my main job, I work in sales, and like
Yes.
good, a lot of people think that they could do sales because they know how to have conversation, and people like that, their friends like them, and da da da. It's like that's not really what it is. It's like, and it really becomes about understanding the person who's sitting across from you, right? Like there's like to the point. I think that there's, can 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 every single person can be like argued into submission? No. And that's like a foolish way of viewing the world, right? And so I think, and that's where I've personally let the term libertarian fall to the wayside as it relates to my identity, because I'm not really interested in being associated with that. Like I listen, I can have the esoteric conversation. We can go through the logic of a situation and a case, and you can proof it out as much as you want, and I'll admit where I make a mistake. But that doesn't mean like, here's an exchange. This is an example of what I'm talking about. Sorry, I'm rambling. But I had an exchange on Twitter the other day where like a guy, Matt, Matt Erickson from King Pilled had tweeted something about how all wars are religious wars, and because like belief emanates from religion, and I think that generally holds. That generally holds up as a tweet, but somebody kind of replied saying like, well, no, because the will to live and like to protect one's young is like inherent. Well, he was kind of trying to argue that it's inherent, so it doesn't necessarily, or that doesn't necessarily come from religion. Where I kind of, and I responded to that, I pointed out that like infanticide is very common if you look back historically in societies, and certainly in the animal kingdom, infanticide is like the rule, not the norm, or not the exception, I should say. Um, and that and I don't even need to point to like modern abortion movements to kind of prove my point. And that so that still leaves open the question of what creates the belief. And what he was trying to do was argue a very logical but irrelevant point, that because you can potentially account for other methods for something, that means that the assertion is invalid. And you don't disprove an assertion just by pointing out that there are other possibilities. You have to prove it wrong, right, in order to go so. And he used a metaphor of a car, where he's like, well, there's other, like, you can get out and push a car, or it can go down a hill. And I'm like, yeah, but that doesn't change the fact that an engine is what drives a car, right? If I'm thinking of how I'm going to get around in a car, I'm not thinking about pushing it over, right? Now, he wanted to get lost in philosophical abstractions, but he lost sight of a very important one, namely a telos. And I think that happens sometimes with what we might call it a libertarian desire to have a perfectly rational explanation for things. I don't know. I don't know if it's libertarian specific, but it certainly seems to be prevalent. And I'm not saying that I wasn't, partial to this at one point in time as well. A lot of my perspective has changed when I kind of left an academic environment and started working in like a manufacturing environment.
Yeah, I know. I see what you mean there. There's a lot of there's a lot of questions out there to be asked. It's a question, what really does, how do you get people to act? I just started reading 48 Laws of Power, and I think that's a book I should have read a long time ago, just to figure out how you get people to act a certain ways. It's definitely, there's definitely things out there. You mentioned the Reformation. I mean, what do you think about a lot of people say that the Reformation was a rejection of Aristotle in favor of Plato. What do you think about that?
I'd have to look at the arguments a little more closely. I don't know if I've heard that one in particular. I guess I don't know that I completely see it. I think there might be a case to be made that the Protestant Reformation was a mistake. But I can see how it was valid at the time. I could see how people would have complaints at the time. And also, at least I was taught this in school, I don't know how much truth it has, but that Martin Luther wasn't really interested in creating a new branch of Christianity. He was interested in reforming the church, and just the corruption of the church at that moment was such that it didn't happen. It didn't happen soon enough. And then people took advantage of a political situation created by a vacuum of power that kind of had a cascade effect. But for all the faults of the Catholic Church, and there are many, and I don't think I shouldn't be confused as somebody who would downplay those. I don't think that they're unique to the Catholic Church. I think if you were to point, I think that's just that Catholics represent one of the largest bodies of Christians in the United States. So there's just a lot more of them. There's been there, and of course, we've seen with the Boy Scouts, which is a secular organization, if nominally Christian, and certainly we also see with like public school teachers and with coaches, is that in regards to the abuse of underage children, is what we see is that predators will go to where they can have access to their prey, as we should expect a predator to act. Kind of going back to one of the things I said before, is like the problem with the egalitarian delusion is you kind of believe that anybody could be a predator. It's like, no, predators are predators. So we have to find out what those behaviors look like, and we have to make sure that we account for them and we get rid of those people as best that we're able, and to make sure that they can't prey on their victims. Yeah, and I by the way, I completely agree with your point that the time that the churches needed to be open, they were closed, and I think that if you believe in divine judgment, they will have to atone for those sins. And I know I happen to know that there were orders given that there were orders given of not trying to push against the what the governments were saying. So again, so like if the yeah, I don't know. We're kind of rambling at this point. Sorry. What we're talking? What did I answer your question?
It's, there is Thomas Paine observed that he felt like the Quakers were a lot less authoritarian because they didn't really have priests. They had no authorities and basically just said that everybody's an authority because anybody can speak up at the Quaker meetings. I don't know how, and I do think that's maybe part of the problems is you put these people in positions of authority, and eventually it devolves into places where is temptation. I mean, it's the axiom of Lord Acton, who says power tends to corrupt. Absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Do you know what he was talking about there?
You mean the context of that? I don't know the whole thing. Yeah.
I've been kind of doing some digging into it, and I have to find a couple other sources, and I'm going to publish it. So like, what it comes from a series of letters that he wrote to somebody who was like giving an introduction, and basically the crux of his argument had something to do with the fact that it's like, like Malice formulates it as like, if the truth and lies are asymmetrical. If you tell me the truth 100 times, but you lie to me once, I'm going to remember you as a liar. And so his point was talking about like how do you interpret historical figures? And do you interpret their good acts and their bad acts on balance, or do the bad things outweigh the good things? Right. And if you do something wrong for the right reasons, what is that? Is that still something wrong? And that's where he actually that's where that axiom is derived from.
And there's this tendency among political movements where you want to conduct jihads, where people want to conduct jihads against people who agree with them on 90% of the issues, but they're mad at them because of that 10% where they disagree.
Yeah, that's libertarians towards the American right.
That's a lot of people, not just libertarians, but yes,
yeah, no, sorry.
Lately I've just been asking myself the question that really you should be asking. If this person's fighting a lot of good fights, how do I get him to fight a few more good fights? Or fight the good fights that he's not fighting? I mean,
yeah.
And really, that's really what you want here, isn't it? I mean, I don't know. It's very interesting to see the dynamic among various political movements and the way these people stab each other in the back and misrepresent, and the misrepresentation is often what I find so annoying is somebody says 2 + 2 = 4. I said, well, did you say 3 + 3 = 6? I said, no, I said 2 + 2 = 4. So right. Yeah.
Well, and I think there's something to be said for the fact that it's that's kind of the reality though, is like if you're interested in politics, and I was somebody who like oh, you're a political guy, huh? I'm like, no, I don't like politics, man. It's all about moving beyond politics. And it's kind of like you have to look at yourself after you say that a bunch of times, but you're still following politics closely, and you have to say, okay, maybe I actually kind of like politics, right? And it's like if you're going to be interested in politics, but then you don't want anything to do with politics, that kind of creates a tension that's going to make it difficult for you to build a movement. And I think, like I said, it's kind of it's just a different way of perceiving things. And I think there are, I think there are enough challenges that we have to face with looming fiscal insolvency and, monetary suicide and the geopolitical situation, that getting lost in the minutia of arguments is going to happen from time to time, but you should try and keep moving in the direction that you're going. So then the question is, what direction are you heading? You know, people might say, oh, it's liberty. It's like, okay, well, what kind of liberty? Because there's at least 3. There's at least 2, or rather there's at least 2 definitions of that. And so you see it's not as easy as like 20th century political ideologies would have you believe it to be. And that's again, going back to the idea of the post-liberal order, is to say like, socialism, fascism, communism, libertarianism. It's all not doing anything. Like what, like this, oh, the neoliberals and neoconservatives. Well, why do we call them that? Well, because they don't really
Yeah.
like stay true to the ideals that we think liberalism and
Yeah.
conservatism are. It's like, okay,
Well,
what do they have in common? Well, they're all in positions of power, so they're the ones that actually have control.
yeah. Sometimes I think what gets me, and it seems like the right does it more often than the left, is they get upset about things that are not important. I mean, the $1 trillion deficit, the fiscal insolvency that's coming along, the ridiculous welfare spending that we have, the ridiculous corruption that's occurring, the the possibility that we're going to have a nuclear war. But what gets conservatives more upset than anything else is somebody takes a knee during the national anthem. They're just ready. They're just ready to go. They'll get that's the most important thing in the world. That I'm like, what are your priorities?
I mean, for most of them, it's like working, 40 to 50 hours a week, probably, taking the family out to dinner. It's like, like that's actually their priority. That's actually most people priorities.
I understand.
They've been trained. No, this is an important point because they've been trained just like the left, just like the liberals have too. They've been trained on this like specific idea of what politics is and what political discourse looks like. And they've been fed these kinds of stories by the media. It's like, so it's like, yeah, and everybody does that. I mean, we just saw the alt space blow up around this chick Eliza Blue, who's like been searching for fame her whole life, right? Like this, this happens, that this people, I don't love it either, but it's like, but I've come to realize that people, there's something to a story that has no meaning that like lets you get outraged about it.
Yes.
And maybe it has something to do with that like apocryphal quote that says something like 100 people dying is a tragedy, but 1 million people dying is a statistic.
Yes.
Like you can sit here and say that like, we both just talked about it, and I'm not saying it's not true, but like we can talk about fiscal insolvency and like that the government is never going to pay back its debts. It's not going to stop me from making money.
Oh yeah,
or being upset that I'm getting paid in U.S. dollars.
Yeah,
you know what I mean. Like our ideas have like we think about something as a threshold, and it has to be informed by like what actually is in front of us, or else you're too lost in the you're too lost in the esoteric.
And the Eliza Blue situation reminds me of something several years ago that I remember Andrew Tate said on a show I was watching.
And he's another one.
And he said, yes, but this is what Andrew Tate said. He said, attention is the currency.
Yeah.
Men give more attention in an argument than they ever give their girl. And he said, yeah. So here's Eliza Blue. That's all she wants. Attention. So whatever you do, don't give it to her. And there are sometimes situations where I just ask myself, is she just wanting attention?
Well, I think at the end of the day, it's that, we all want attention. I mean, that's why I have a show, or presumably that's why you have a show. Like there's something to that. There's something innate to our being as creatures. It's a question of how you, it's the tactics you take to implement that matter.
Yeah.
Right. And that's where virtue comes in.
That's another person I think is to a certain extent getting railroaded. Although I'm curious to know what your take on the whole Tate situation is. My take is Rollo Tomasi pointed out that he thought they're really going after Tate because of money laundering, but all these alleged sex crimes and stuff are more salacious. So that's why the media talks about that. Money laundering is really kind of a boring thing to talk about. What do you think, or do you have an opinion on all that?
I mean, I don't know a ton about the guy I mean, like I'm not. I like the super flashy. Here's my Lambo is not my aesthetic.
Yeah.
I understand why, and like that it's not to say I don't enjoy a good rap video, and I enjoy that about like I grew up loving hip hop, so like I'm not saying I'm above it. I'm not saying, and this isn't to say that I don't enjoy the finer things in life, because I absolutely do. I think he's a savvy operator. He knows what he's doing. and I think he's effective. And it's what's certainly interesting is the cultural effect he's had on younger minds, given his dissemination on TikTok. But yeah, I mean, do I think he's the perfect? Do I think he's a good male role model? No, I don't.
Yeah, I think he's a logical response to a society which has just declared war on men, and he's telling men it's okay to be a man, screw them, and for that he's right. Maybe
yeah,
it's
but a
not
lot of
necessarily
people
the
are
right way,
saying that.
but he's a logical response to what's happening in the culture.
Right, he's
I
a
don't think
reaction, and he's kind of he's an overemphasized reaction. He's an over
yeah.
not overemphasized. He's like he's a caricature. That's what he
Yeah,
is.
and he has achieved some things in life. You know, he did get very good at kickboxing and did some things there. And
Yeah,
his
but I'm pretty sure
father,
his money comes from
yeah,
porn and cam
and
girls.
his
So like
father,
not exactly
yeah,
a virtuous pursuit.
yeah, porn is porn is definitely something that seems to, I come from I come from the last generation. The first time I saw a dirty picture, it was in a magazine, and
Sure.
now it's just so abundant that it's no big deal anymore. Another interesting thing, Tate's father was also a very well respected chess master. You can look him up on. I mean, he was well respected enough that he has an article on Wikipedia. You can look him up.
Well, that would make sense.
Every Tate, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, again, he's certainly a tactician, right? Like, there's a lot of people who want attention, fame, celebrity, status, whatever words you want to use for that. And then there's a question. Everybody wants that. So what tactics, what skills, what things can you employ to like reach that? That's the that's always the actual question. Yeah. So I would say, I mean, again, and he's made it from what I've, some people have said he's an interesting person to talk to. I wouldn't turn down the opportunity to hang out with him, as long as, given, depending on the context, but like, it's not, but again, like aesthetically speaking, he's not like really he's not necessarily my cup of tea, and again, that's not to say that I'm like averse. It's not to say I'm an aesthetic that like doesn't enjoy the finer things in life, because I absolutely do. I just, I don't enjoy an overly ostentatious presentation like that.
I don't. Yeah, although sometimes that's what you have to do to get attention. But yeah, I don't. I
also think the way that he talks about women is.
I like simple. I like simple things. If I ever got to a point where I was was making $1 million a year, I'd probably start flying first class. There are things I probably would do that I don't do now, but otherwise, it's like I don't really need all these things. There's certainly things out there. Speaking of music, I was really intrigued by one of the things you said that said you really like pop music in some of the Spanish speaking countries, and you said you listen to a lot of that. What's motivated that desire?
You can't say the N-word anymore, and I memorized the lyrics to songs.
Yeah.
Honestly, I mean, no, I've always loved Spanish music. I mean, I'm half Spanish or whatever, so like I've always enjoyed it. But no, it's just kind of like, just like a few years ago, I was always like a super always listening to podcasts. And then, I worked at a store, and like the store would be playing music, and I could sometimes play my music. So that's like, those would be the times that I would listen to music. Then I got a different job where I'm driving I travel all the time. So like, you can only listen to podcasts for so long before you start to get wearied, like heavy-eyed, or at least I do. So like I had to start listening to music, and I kind of thought like, oh, this will help my Spanish a little bit. And then, it's just kind of now like I still listen to like some American pop and like really popular songs, or like I listen to a lot of like house or EDM music, whatever you're supposed to call it now, as well. But yeah, I like Spanish pop, and I always like pop music in general. It's kind of my that's like my dirty pleasure. I still listen to opera and classical and all the things you would expect of such a towering intellect, but I also enjoy, I enjoy just simple love songs.
Yeah, it's all, I've long had this. In fact, I think I came up with when I was a teenager, but I call it the Dick Clark anti-aging theory. And it's basically the theory that you keep yourself young by staying up on popular music. And you look at Dick Clark and how he hosted American Bandstand for all those years, a show, and had these teenagers dancing on this show. And he obviously, and the guy never aged.
Yeah.
For all those years. It's like, And I said, keep listening to music. It will keep you young. You know, that's yeah. So there it is, the Dick Clark anti-aging theory. It's just a theory, but it makes sense to me.
And it is one of those things that I do it to try and, because I really, I'm careful about what I like take in to my brain, because it's inputs and
Yeah,
outputs. So like I don't consume a lot of like, I don't consume like a lot of network programming, and I don't consume a lot of cable programming at this point. So I'm kind of like but music is one of those things where I can kind of relax, and for the most part, with few exception, I can just enjoy a song, and not have to get lost in the interpretation of it. But with obviously with some songs, that's inevitable. But and it, what I don't see, and like, so the point of like why I listen more to Spanish music is, for me at least, and it's also maybe just the Spanish music I like, it's just about having fun and like, having a good time and partying and dancing and falling in love, and
yeah,
like, so those are the types of things that I want in my music, not not a not a coded political message, as it were.
yeah. It's almost as if too that maybe it's kind of where pop music in America was back in the 50s. Because
Oh, there's an element of that for sure.
there was a certain innocence to popular music in America before the 60s. It seemed like once the 60s got in there, it got politicized. It was never, you didn't really ever hear it being political before the mid to late 60s. Do you travel to Mexico or other places a lot, or
With some regularity, but not a great frequency.
just Mexico or others?
Mexico, Canada.
Okay. Oh, so that's sales of it. Any places in Mexico or Canada that you really like, or
I you know I what's fun frankly is just like traveling to different places,
yeah,
and kind of seeing how people live in different parts of the world. People who travel for a living kind of understand this, but it's like a lot of times you don't actually really get to explore. You know what I mean?
yeah, and I understand. Yeah, if it's for work, you don't always get to explore. I totally understand that.
Yeah. So it's less. So it's more. So but you always get to meet interesting people and kind of see
Yeah.
see how people live in different parts. That's what I enjoy at
Any
least.
place you thought, boy, I think I might want to live here, or maybe you just didn't get to know these places that well.
Bean Station, Tennessee.
Where Station,
I
Tennessee?
think it was called something like Bean Station, Tennessee.
Where's that?
It's in a valley. It's beautiful.
Where's that? Near
Tennessee.
east, west, central?
Somewhere. I don't remember. I was driving on the highway and passed through it like 4 years ago. I think it's Bean
Okay.
Station.
Yeah, I'm always curious because I mean, the biggest thing for me, of course, is as I
Yeah.
remember when I went to Peru, went to Peru, and it's like, okay, this is what poverty really looks like.
Yeah, right.
You don't
There's
see it in
definitely
America.
mhm. It is it's East Tennessee is what it would be,
Yeah.
which would make sense because I would have been traveling from Johnson City to there.
Any place you really liked in Mexico, or
I mean, Veracruz is nice, but it's on the beach. I haven't been to like Cancun or any of the other big places like that, so I don't have like a good comparison.
I've actually been to Acapulco the most. I really liked Guadalajara. Puerto Vallarta is okay, although the people are a little aggressive when they try to sell you stuff. But
Sure.
uh, Guadalajara is nice. Mexico City's okay. Mexico City seems pretty nice, although it's really high there, and I have to admit, when I get up to 7,000 feet, I'm just always getting headaches.
Yeah, I did. I went to Colorado. I spent a lot of time in Colorado. It was like way up in the mountains. It was a very interesting experience, that's for sure.
Yeah, yeah. Were you involved with the Libertarian Party that much or not?
Basically dipped my toe in and then kind of came to the conclusions that I
Yeah,
came to that I wrote about in the post-libertarian moment
yeah.
defined.
You
Yeah.
know,
But it was something that I earnestly was going to it was something I engaged in earnestly. It wasn't that
yeah.
it wasn't like some grift or anything like that. I really
Oh yeah.
I really took it upon myself as an exploration and to decide whether I thought it was something worth doing.
It would be interesting to see where the Libertarian Party would be now, as if they could have just kept everybody who ever joined at least once. I've long said they should do exit interviews. One thing we didn't get on, and talking about things that promote liberty. What do you think about Bitcoin?
I think Bitcoin in particular, and cryptos in generally it's very interesting. I will say I'm a little annoyed as somebody who bought late that I now, I'm down as far as Bitcoin is concerned. But over the long term, I think it's an interesting alternative. I'm not a I'm not a crypto or a Bitcoin maximalist. I'm far more pragmatic in that regard. As far as like what people can use as currency.
Yes.
Uh, but I think but in general, but like I also, if tomorrow I started getting paid in Bitcoin and I could use Bitcoin everywhere, I would have no issues using Bitcoin everywhere.
Yes. The Fountainhead Forum is not financial advice. The Fountainhead Forum is not tax advice. The Fountainhead Forum is not legal advice. Thank you. So anyway, yeah, I see Bitcoin really as creating a system that cannot be messed up by the masses, or at least creating a system that's difficult for them to mess up. I mean, because they're going, it's democracy is always going to kill capitalism. So if you want to have democracy or if you want to have capitalism, then create a system that they can't vote out of existence. And I think Bitcoin at least makes it harder for them to screw things up, but they might try to figure something out. I don't think we'll ever have a gold standard and have a democracy. And I think a lot of people,
Well,
Bitcoin
I think
feel that way.
this is an interesting. Sorry, this is an interesting thing about like Bitcoin though, and also I think it kind of ties to this like ethos that kind of permeated the online culture of the late 90s and early 2000s, which really looked at this ability to have decentralized technology and like decentralized exchange of ideas and stuff like that. And I think there was a belief, an idea that those things would be adopted by the masses when they were presented to them. And again, I think this ties to our conversation about liberty and libertarian philosophy, as well as like the idea was like, oh well, once people were presented with it, they're gonna jump at the chance of having all this freedom and how they can exist in this online space. And what did we see was that people liked using platforms like Facebook and Instagram that put all the information in front of you. And I think and again, the point here isn't to criticize. The point is to point to something unique about us as creatures and to recalibrate recalibrate like how we build, politics or governments or whatever around that, if that makes sense.
I see crypto as a way to rebuild finance, and of course, once you rebuild finance, and the whole point is decentralized finance, decentralized money.
Right, but a lot of people who have crypto are using like a Coinbase. That was kind of my point.
Yeah,
It's like
the on ramps and the on ramps are you still have the on ramps and the off ramps. Yeah, that's important.
Yeah,
to note. Yeah,
it's not to say that people can't put it underneath their mattress, but it is to say that most people are going to choose to keep their money in a bank.
Yeah, I think it's probably going to be that way. It'll be interesting, but it's really amazing what people have done, and there's a lot of different competition too in cryptocurrency. I mean, when I fly with American Airlines, I always ask these people, how long you've been with American, and so many times they'll say, well, I actually got started with this airline, then we merge. Crypto can't be merged. So there's always going to be a lot of competition, and so it'll never even come close to ever being monopolized in any way, although there are certainly ways you can screw around with it that might monopolize it, but I don't see how it's ever going to get corrupted that way. So
yeah, and I'm not saying I'm smart enough to figure it out, but I do know that there's always an angle, you know what I mean? And for people,
yeah,
and give people enough time. Well, and like you see it now with like mining, right? You can invest in like super heavy GPUs and like chain computers together to try, right? Like there's ways of gaming the system, as it were, because it's supposed to be the same way. And that's what we are. We're creatures that use tools to accomplish a task. And so if something becomes valuable enough, then more people will kind of figure out ways to try and skirt the system. And that will be I think that'll be the true stress test for something like Bitcoin.
yes, and the fact that it's decentralized is certainly a help. Well, anything else you want to say before we go? I don't really have. This has certainly been an interesting talk about ideas. We need to have more of those. So
no, yeah, I appreciate you having me on. And if anybody has heard if what I've had to say sounds interesting, I encourage you to head over to Binawake. Sorry,
Binawake.com. Yeah, no, certainly.
Head over to
You know,
binawake.com, subscribe to the Substack with your email. That
yeah,
way we stay in touch.
yeah, and I'd be interested in having a conversation like this with Matt too. Matt has some interesting points of view. I don't agree with him on everything, but yeah, there's always we got to get ideas out there, and if we can get people to listen to ideological conversations, I think we'll have better discourse. I think podcasts like this might be saving discourse in a lot of ways. We can have better conversations and get more things out there. And
I will say, going back to kind of like some of my pushback earlier against like conservative tropes, is I think there's a big difference between the conservative that watches Fox News every day and just like ingests the fear porn versus the conservative who listens to Joe Rogan,
oh
right?
yes,
And it comes from that state of openness, and that is exactly what I try to do and demonstrate and model is something like that in my show.
yeah, and the beauty of Rogan or anybody or like Lex Friedman is you can get and really explore a topic in depth. I mean, and if you really want to dig deep and go into it, it's really something to talk about. So, okay, I will shut the recording off, and we will hopefully get this up soon. So, no. Thank you for coming on, LB. Bye bye.
Thanks for having me, Chris.